Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by regulatorwatch.com. Last Thursday, on April 25th, 2019, RegWatch published a as-yet unpublished study by Professor David Hammond from the University of Waterloo. This study is all about vaping and youth and purportedly shows an increase in youth vaping. This study has been referenced by almost everybody we've talked with in the last 6 months, from researchers to the head of Health Canada. It seemed that everybody had seen this study except for members of the public, tobacco harm reduction activists, and of course people from the industry. RegWatch released this study, a source provided it to us, and we did that in the name of public interest. Joining us today is Clive Bates from the E-Cigarette Summit in Washington, D.C. Clive, thanks for coming back on RegWatch.
It's a pleasure, Brent. Glad to be here.
So obviously we made a bit of a stink with this whole publication. The University of Waterloo issued RegWatch a cease and desist order, which we responded back politely and said no thanks, but we're willing, of course, to work with them on certain things. But this certainly is definitely in the public interest. Would you not say that's the case?
Yeah, I think when these papers are being used to influence policy, then really all stakeholders should have access to them. It's quite simple, really. You can take a paper like that and you can put all kinds of different interpretations on it. So it's important to be able to get under the headline numbers, and there has been a rise in teen vaping in Canada, but there's more to the story than that, and you don't know what that is unless you can see the detailed numbers in the paper. For example, almost all of the vast majority of the vapors are infrequent users. Okay, so they're using, a few times a month, parties, messing around, blowing, sharing, whatever. It's not something that should attract an emergency response from public health. Then amongst the frequent users, what you see is that many of them are also smokers. And for them, there could even be a benefit. They could be benefiting from vaping, diverting them away from smoking. So my call with papers like this is that you need to take a more nuanced view of what's going on under the covers, and you can't do that until you actually see the paper.
It's a bit difficult for us to understand how this paper could be used by government, and from what we understand, some nonprofits too as well have seen it. It seems that everybody's seen it, and how it could be impacting regulatory processes, but it not be made public. Like, how is that the case?
I don't think that should be the case. I think if they're going to use a paper for influencing, they have difficulties because there is a formal publication timetable. Academic journals move, at the speed of a glacier, so they can't always get data that they think is relevant to the policy process out prior to, if they have to wait for publication. And that's the tension that Professor Hammond has faced. And I have some sympathy with him here. He's got good data and he wants to share it. The problem is the interpretation that's put on that. People can pick and choose and cherry pick from a big data paper like that and say, oh, this is the big headline number, this is the thing you should focus on. Whereas I would focus perhaps on something different, which is how many of the users are frequent users and how many of those users are non-smokers, how many are smokers. Now, unless you know that, in my view, I don't think you can really make a proper assessment of the data. And therefore, it should be, if anyone sees it, everyone sees it. And that's the difficulty we're in. I don't want to get into condemning anybody or criticizing anybody. It is a basic problem. You want to use the data, but everybody should be able to see it and comment on it and interpret it in a way that helps Health Canada, frankly, form the best view of what the paper is actually telling us.
So that is the case then, isn't it? It's not necessarily always the data, it's the interpretation of the data, which different people from different positions could see a different story come out of that same data.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And you can tell a different story from. You can come in with the headline, oh, there's been a huge increase in vaping, or you can come in and say, look, there's this tiny group of people who we should be worried about, who are vaping intensively, who are not smokers. The smokers may be benefiting, who we should try and understand what's going on with them. They could be people who've already stopped smoking. They could be people who are using marijuana. There are all kinds of interpretations that you could go further into that I don't believe you can get from that paper. But the point is, you have to narrow the focus down to identify what is the real public health problem. And a few kids blowing silly clouds at a party is not a major public health emergency, and it shouldn't prompt a gigantic overreaction from Health Canada, which would have the effect of harming adults. You have to have a pretext if you're going to start doing things that make it harder for adults to quit smoking.
This is the question everybody in the public who's been watching the story for the last 9 months is going to want to know, is does this study, does it support the statement that there is an epidemic of youth vaping?
No, it doesn't support that. Epidemic is an inappropriate and alarmist term for anyone in public health to be using. We reserve epidemics for things like cholera and the like. There has been a steep increase, okay? But before you start taking in emergency measures and you start changing your policy, you have to get under the skin of those numbers and find out what's really going on. And most of that increase is people who are using e-cigarettes very infrequently. They're just messing about, experimenting, being silly teenagers, basically. It's not a cause for an emergency response. And then amongst the frequent users, a lot of them are smokers, and for them it may be beneficial. So when you get into the numbers, you see a completely different view of the problem. It's a much smaller problem, and it's much less of a cause for panic than we've seen in both Canada and the United States.
So describe then how then that problem might be a bit conflated, purposefully or not. Is it the fact that people who are already smoking when they're as youth are trying vaping? I mean, it feels like that they're trying to squish the issue into making it sound like vapors turn into smokers, or there's some kind of real cause and effect relationship there. There's that, and then there's also the cannabis issue that's creeping up with inside the vaping of cannabis, which has just taken off in popularity. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, there's several things going on. The rise in vaping isn't connected to a rise in smoking. It does, it seem, I understand anyway from the paper, that there has been a rise in smoking as well. Now, that is alarming. That is what we should be concerned about. The overwhelming focus should be on the most harmful behavior, and the most harmful behavior is smoking. So if there's been an increase in that, the focus should be on that and not on the rise in vaping, in my opinion, because vaping is more or less benign. It's not a particularly harmful habit.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that some of the demonization of vaping, of nicotine, has played some role in that? Because I wonder if there is a lack of trust that's happening amongst youth when it comes to public health and what they're being told, because they have common sense and they can understand that this vaping of this thing is not like burning a cigarette, but you bang into their heads that this thing is just as bad as a cigarette. They kind of lose their perspective, and maybe they just go, what the hell, I might as well smoke.
I think there is a danger for the public health groups and that are making this line, making the alarmist statements about vaping, is that they will lose credibility. In the end, people are using these products and they can feel the difference. They know the difference. They can read, they can look up, there's a share intelligence and so on. So they will know that there's a different story out there. And if the different story fits better with their own experience, they'll go with that story. And they will lose trust and respect for what should be trusted and respected bodies in Canada and elsewhere. So that is a danger. I think some of this stuff about trying to say that vaping is as dangerous as smoking, not only is it deeply unethical and scientifically ridiculous, it's deeply harmful. The people saying it will never be trusted again in future. And that behavior is a little bit like the tobacco companies used to do, trying to claim that there was very little risk with smoking. Trying to claim that there's a high risk with an alternative to smoking is kind of logically and ethically symmetrical to claiming that there's a very low risk with smoking. So I think they are behaving really, really badly. And the fact that people don't understand that the risks are so much lower, and the risk perception surveys, I think in Canada and the United States and the UK, show that people really don't get it. They really don't understand how much their risk would be reduced by switching to these products. It's a real indictment of the way that the public health movement has conducted itself over this issue.
One of the interviews that we did with you back 2.5 years ago, you had mentioned something that has always sat very strongly with us, was the discussion of nicotine. And you described how one of the disadvantages of vaping, and this is pre-nicotine salts, was the fact that nicotine does take some time to absorb into the bloodstream and reach the brain, and really that getting it to the brain as fast as possible to mimic the effects of what cigarette smoking is was a highly desirable thing. And that seems to be exactly what Juul did with the engineering of their entire technology, was really to deliver that for smokers. And yet it's that exact thing that tobacco control says that they've done just purposefully to hook kids. Instead, it was actually done for smokers.
Exactly. This is so true. I mean, the reason why Juul is an outstanding kind of American success story is that they've cracked that problem. They've made the pharmacokinetics as effective as smoking, using nicotine salts and acids and so on. It's a brilliant piece of innovation, and you can see it in the numbers. You can see the graphs of their increasing market share in the US in particular, just cutting through all the other products. And you can only do that if you've got a winning formula and it's giving people what they want. And we've got into the situation where what is an amazing success story is being interpreted as an incredible failure of regulation, where actually it's a fantastic story of innovation and ultimately will contribute to the end of smoking, in my view. So yeah, again, keep your heads about you. There's a massive prize here to be had, and don't put yourself on the side of the enemies of innovation. It's a disruptive technology. There's going to be a few bumps in the road, but look at the potential. It's fantastic.
For those of us that are in Canada, there's still time left on this second consultation. That's the big one, really. This is the shoe that dropped. This is where flavors and nicotine and even access for adults to devices are on the table. How would you advise any of our viewers that have had access to this study? Now, RegWatch has removed it from download until we kind of sort things out with the University of Waterloo. We're not happy about that, but we're definitely going to play some ball with them until we figure out where they stand. The fact of the matter is that we've published it and it's out there. And you're not the only researcher and person that works within this space that has said, thank you very much, RegWatch, for publishing it, because they're utilizing it in upcoming conferences and everything else. So the question is, if you are somebody that has come across this study now, and you want to utilize it in a submission to Health Canada with regard to this consultation that's in front of us, what's your advice to them on how to best utilize this study?
Well, my advice to most people who are not specialized in this field is don't go there. All of these papers are incredibly difficult to read and interpret and everything. For most people, the right thing to do is to write about your experience, write about what it's meant for you, write about what the changes that Health Canada have in mind would do for you and what dangers they would put you in, what you think about the effect on your family and so on. Okay, so personalized account of what these things mean for you really cuts it in the political debate. If, however, you're someone who's got a bit of scientific background, you want to read these things, then there are things to look out for in that paper. As I was saying earlier, how many of the vapors are frequent vapors? How many of them are smokers? Would they benefit from being vapors? How many are non-smoking, and what's their history up till now? Those are the questions to be asking about that paper, and they are useful points to make, and those points will be made. But I have to stress to everybody, you shouldn't feel intimidated by academic papers. Look at it and think, oh my goodness, it's like a bewildering set of tables or whatever. I can't possibly do anything useful with this. Talk about your experience. Talk about how you feel about it. Talk about what it would mean to you if they took flavors off the market. Talk about how you're concerned that your journey would no longer be available to other people who are still smoking, because that cuts through that cuts through all this academic stuff, and it makes sense to people who are evaluating these policies. They think, oh yeah, I can see that's going to do this sort of damage. So in my experience, those are the most telling testimonies that you get from people making their own unique experience available to regulators.
Now, for the regulators then, and the researchers that seem to be working with them on moving this stuff forward, what's your advice to them?
Well, I would remain calm. There's a few things I would say. First of all, keep your head. Your job here is to do the best for public health, not respond to a media-generated moral panic. Okay, so keep your head. Secondly, I would be saying focus on harm. Your job is to deal with cancer, heart disease, respiratory illnesses, stroke, all that sort of terrible stuff that comes with smoking. Focus on the harms. Keep your eye on the combustibles, the smoking. The smoke-free products are not really the problem. They're not that harmful, and most people aren't using them that frequently. If they are using them frequently, they're usually using them as an alternative to smoking. So get a sense of perspective on where these things fit relative to combustible products. And then finally, I would say whatever you do, if you're going to implement new policies on the back of this, watch out for unintended consequences. You think you can ban flavors? What about all the adult vapors who are using flavors to stay off cigarettes? Do they relapse? Do they no longer switch? Do they feel as though they've been let down and relapse? So, really focus on, could the things that you're doing actually make things worse? You want to ban vaping advertising? Well, what if vaping advertising functions as a form of anti-smoking advertising? And actually, it's a beneficial thing to public health rather than a threat to public health. Always, always, always focus on those unintended consequences, because they will dominate the effect of your policy if you're not careful. And it would potentially mean that you do more harm than good if you aren't careful.